Today we're going to do a number of things. I want to go back and finish the slides from the last lecture. I also think it might be worth actually reviewing some of the slides that I did cover towards the end, because I think I was rushing a little bit. I've also got a handful of new slides, not very many, but it's something else that I wanted to talk about. I just posted these to BSpace about half an hour ago. I apologize I didn't get them together last night. I also want to talk, there's a slideshow from National Geographic about slums in Mumbai that I thought we might take a look at as well. Housekeeping matters. Yesterday I got an email from the department reminding me that the instructor drop deadline is actually this coming Tuesday. When is the student drop deadline? Do you have any idea? Friday of next week? Of this week? That seems way too early. Pardon? The early drop deadline. After that you have to pay. Oh, wow. Okay. This is like checking bags on airlines. So what this means is that on Monday, when I sit down with the GSIs, we are going to look over the list of people who are actually enrolled in the class and compare that to the list of people who have come to section. The wait list has shrunk, but not very much. It's still in the ballpark of 35, 40 people. So if we find numerous people who have enrolled in the class but have not come to section and have not explained their absence from section, on Monday or Tuesday, I will drop those students in order to make room for people who are on the wait list and have been coming to section. Does that make sense? Now, presumably, if there are people who are not coming to the class but are enrolled, they're not here right now. So they're not getting this announcement from me. Presumably, this is nothing but good news for everyone who's in the room right now. But I did nonetheless want to clarify that. Are there any questions about that? Okay. Let's start with this slideshow from National Geographic. No, wrong thing. That's the one I want. There we go. I'm not sure whether this is going to advance on its own or whether I'm going to need to advance it myself. This is from, what's the issue? February 2000, no, that's current issue, February 2010. I'll find the date of this if you'd like. It's from about a year and a half ago. And as you can see here, the sort of overall headline, as Mumbai booms, the poor of its notorious Dharavi slum find themselves living in some of India's hottest real estate. I read somewhere recently, I don't think it was in Davis, that office space in Mumbai, which is priced how? How is office space priced in large cities? Do you know? Per square foot or per square meter, depending on the system being used. So this is not like per acre. This is per square foot. The office space in Mumbai is apparently the most expensive office space in the world. More expensive even than Manhattan or Tokyo or London or Paris. As Mumbai has boomed, areas on the edges of it or close to downtown that have been previously slums, as pictured here, are becoming the object of investors' interest. And there are pitched battles between both investors and city officials, government officials, who want to see these lands transformed into more formal and more lucrative uses, and the people living in these slums, often, hundreds of thousands of them. And part of the interest of this slideshow, or these photographs from National Geographic, apart from the fact that National Geographic reliably provides great photographs, is that it gives a better sense, I think, of what life is actually like in this slum. This particular slum has become the object of considerable international attention because of the sort of the extreme circumstances, the extreme value of the real estate and the pressures to develop it on the one side, and the extreme size and longevity and sort of intensity of the habitation of the folks living in the slum. So as we work our way through these pictures, and there are captions at the bottom, if city planners prevail, high-rise residential blocks and industrial parks will replace the dense web of metal-roofed homes and shops in Dharavi. Bisected by 60 feet road, that's the name of the road, the slum borders a mangrove swamp and the upscale Bandra neighborhood to the north. That 60-foot road through the middle of it is, a sort of normal city street or major city street, an artery that happens to cut right through the middle of this. Now, see how quickly the Air Bears connection can provide us the links. Here's a street scene. Why is this not tabbing down for me? Oh, come along. How much gymnastics am I going to have to do here? A young girl strolls along a leaky water pipe through Dharavi's industrial district. Oh, this is going to take longer than it's worth if my things will not work for me. Maybe I should just shrink this and we can see them smaller. Yes, I will have to shrink it. Come along. One of the points that's made very nicely in this photo essay is that the folks in this area, it's not like these people are just sitting around doing nothing. There are actually large businesses and industries located in the middle of this slum, industries that employ many thousands of people and that have been there in some cases for a great deal of time. This is a man pounding old paint chips into fine powder, which will be reconstituted into paint again. This is not ideal. At one point, I had this working just like a slideshow. Is that what that's going to do? No. Folks doing laundry in a pool of sewer runoff. I would love to find a nice, neat, tidy solution to this here. This is one of the businesses, a boy standing amidst pottery made at a traditional work of the Kumbar caste, set up their communal day pits and kilns in the 1930s. So they've been making pots in the middle of Dharavi for the better part of a century. Some of these photos don't seem to like to come in, or come in only very slowly. Oh, this is not working as well as I'd like it to. I apologize. All right. Maybe that's enough for now. Seeing as how, look, it goes on and on and on. All right, so much for my attempt at high technology and bouncing between various things. Let me find you the date on this in case you'd like to look at it further. So looks like it's probably May 2007. Oh. Never mind. Okay, I give up. Let's come back to the end of the previous lecture. You remember I was suggesting that we use Davis to try to derive some lessons that you might find useful in putting together your research papers later in the semester. And I was talking about regions as patterns whose shape is the result both of what is out there in the world, so to speak, objectively, empirically real that we can see, but also in part a function of how we look at them, or what we call or perceive to be a pattern. That, in turn, being dependent on the scale at which we observe these things, right? So when we look, as those photographs did, at a scale that's very, very localized, individual people, individual households, or streets, we see things that are invisible if looked at from a different scale, say the scale of Mumbai as a whole, in which case that slum shrinks to a sort of region or a piece of the city, and the details of the lives people are leading there sort of aren't so visible, fall out of view. And I suggested that these patterns should not be treated as somehow static or pre-given. They are not simply fixed and natural, but the result of historical processes playing themselves out over time. And I suggested that, again, as with regions, we sort of can't avoid thinking about processes in terms of spatial and temporal scales, specific to those scales. These are abstracted. Patterns and processes are both abstractions that we generate in our heads from the realities we look at in order to try to make sense of them, right? And putting these pieces together, space and time, and thinking about the way they are, in a sense, embedded within each other. So the very small scale or discrete momentary events seem as though we can think of them as sort of inside of longer time periods, larger areas, in these sort of concentric rings. Now, there are some problems with thinking about it in such a neat, tidy, nested kind of way, but it's still a useful way to sort of start the process of trying to make sense of these patterns and processes. And we can put units of time on them, just as we put units of space on the regions. And we can then try to put them together and think about them in their interactions. Now, maybe we can take a few minutes here. Everyone's read the first 3 chapters of Davis, correct? Perhaps as an exercise, if you could get together with your neighbor, a couple of neighbors, and try to think about Davis and what you've read so far in Davis in these terms. For some reason, my laser pointer thing is not working. It may be that my battery is no longer powerful enough. Try to think about what are the processes that Davis has sketched out, at least initially. What are the scales of those processes? What are the temporal periods of those processes? How many of them can you identify? Some of them are political. Some of them are economic. Perhaps each example that he provides is located in a specific place. But if you start seeing the same pattern or the same process at a bunch of different places at the same basic period of time, it becomes tempting to try to think of processes that are somehow operating over larger spatial scales than just those individual cities, right? So take a few minutes, and try to sort of schematically start thinking about what Davis has said about slums in terms of this framework. Could you do that for me? Like 5 minutes, and then we'll talk about it. Okay. How should we start? Who wants to volunteer a process and a space-time scale at which it's operating? Yeah. Okay. Right. Okay, so that's a nice place to start, and it is where Davis starts, right? It's an interesting move from a sort of narrative point of view or a rhetorical point of view. He starts right at the beginning with what is essentially like an event at a household scale, right? The birth of a child or the movement of a family from the countryside into the city. And yeah, that's a very localized, discrete event, but his point is precisely then to blow up, so to speak, scale up radically from that discrete event to the entire world and the distribution of all the people on the planet, and to say this is an event that symbolizes something of perhaps world historical significance. And of course, there's no way of knowing which household, which baby, which migrant family actually tips that statistical balance between a more rural humanity and a more urban humanity. But it's a powerful way of dramatizing what is going on here, right? Or the sort of magnitude and significance of what the entire book is going to then try to unpack or reveal. So it's not really an analytical thing he's doing as far as, analyzing the process, but it's a very good way of dramatizing what's going on here. And it's actually, it's sort of a mark of the kinds of, these types of scale, jumping between scale as a rhetorical or narrative device can be an extremely potent way of of writing. The first couple of years I taught this course, we read Guns, Germs, and Steel, Jared Diamond's very famous book. We don't read it anymore because I'm actually not that fond of it. But if you read it, one of the things he repeatedly does is just that kind of thing. He'll tell a little story based on his own experience talking with somebody somewhere, and then expand it in terms of its significance or its interpretive meaning. Out to much, much broader scales, even broader than the one that Davis is doing here. Okay, who else? Yeah?
On the years and neighborhood scale, you can talk about the squatter camps that get torn down and rebuilt and torn down and rebuilt and finally stay.
Okay. There's, oops, what happened here? There's nothing to say, there's nothing to say that you can only talk about events at the household scale and decades at the city scale, that kind of thing. I mean, this is a schematic. It is possible to talk about something that's spatially discrete, like a particular neighborhood or a particular slum, and think about it over the scale of years or decades, right? So part of the discussion that Davis offers is examples of slums that have cropped up in some place and then gone through this series of being demolished and then rebuilt, demolished and rebuilt. Sometimes they're demolished by natural disasters. Other times they're demolished by bulldozers wielded by the military or the government in an effort to remove these people and replace them with some other kind of settlement. And that process plays itself out over typically many years, perhaps even decades. What else? Yeah?
On the scale of decades, and in some cases years, you can see the periphery of cities, the slums of the periphery, expanding out into rural regions.
Okay.
Pushing the city into the country.
Okay, so if you expand out to the scale of like an entire metro region and look at it over years or decades, you can watch the growth, typically the growth, of the sort of urban footprint or the metropolitan footprint expanding out into the countryside. That's something that, you can do that with remote sensing imagery. You can go online and find the Landsat, satellite pictures of cities from 1977, 1982, and so on and so forth, and watch that through time at that scale. What else? Yeah.
Process like that the nations went through to prevent migration, like there was one China and Venezuela, and I was like, I thought it was like a temporal and a spatial phenomenon that was happening like throughout the world, but
Okay.
it was like before the 1950s, all of like that huge process of preventing urban migration.
Okay, we talked a little bit about this last time. What prevented the growth of slums before about 1950? What changed around then, and then we see this acceleration? And he identifies policies, political positions, laws, practices enforced by colonial governments, the British and the French in Africa, for example, and also by the Chinese, the Soviet Union, to outlaw large-scale migration in various ways, or to set up rules about who could own property in the cities, and therefore who could sort of stay there. And those processes played themselves out typically over many decades, and they were specific to each colony or each country, but they appear to have been a process or a phenomenon that you can see in many, many parts of the world, particularly in what we identify as the second or third worlds in the sort of third world, first world, second world schema. We'll talk about that later in the semester. Yeah?
Well, then, so those countries that we just talked about went from, like, really very rural to very urban, not in a matter of millennia, really, but, like, those nations changed drastically in a matter of years.
Okay.
So after the colonial rule ended, and also when the laws were let down, they went from really urban, just like really fast.
Okay, that's sort of a description of the phenomenon. The point you're trying to draw out is that
Like, so the space-time, relationship with different, nations change drastically, like entire nations, but really fast, not that many years.
so. Perhaps you're pointing out the accelerating rate at which urbanization occurred. You can perhaps track the movement of people into cities, and it appears to be a steady, ongoing, fairly slow process for a century or more. And then, for some reason, it accelerates, and it becomes much more dramatic. And that inflection point in the rate of urbanization is something you can see if you think about it at scales of decades, centuries perhaps. A lot of this is about the end of colonialism, right? And we're going to talk in much greater detail later in the semester about both colonialism and liberation, the point at which the colonies were, achieved independence in various ways, and what that meant and how that played out in various parts of the world. Specifically, we're going to look at Africa. What else? Anybody? What about epochs, continents, millennia? Is there very much of that kind of thing in this book? I mean, maybe that opening example of the shift from a predominantly rural to a predominantly urban global humanity could be seen as something that's playing out at the global scale over not just, that point in time in 2002 or whatever, but actually something that goes back to the beginning of cities, right? Yeah.
He also talked about population growth over the course of the last 50 of life, depending on what frame of time you wanted to look at.
Okay, so does that enter into his argument as part of his explanation of what's going on here? How much of this is about population growth, according to Davis? He hasn't said that much about it, but he does say a few things. Anybody remember? What does he say is the principal demographic driver of this shift to a predominantly urban world? Yeah.
I think you said 95% of the growth was going to happen in the cities.
He did say that, but that's not quite what I'm driving at right now. Where are these people coming from? Yeah. They're coming from the countryside. So this is not about suddenly there is just a change in the rate of population growth per se. This is about a redistribution of existing populations. And granted, that's taking place in the context of an ongoing growth in population. And that growth rate is, in fact, higher in 2000 than it was in 1900. But it's not higher in 2000 than it was in 1980. So it's really principally about the movement of existing living humans from rural settings to urban settings. Yeah? Okay. I'm sorry?
I don't know where that would go.
Where would you put structural adjustment programs? And if you don't know what they are, don't worry about it. We'll figure that out later. If you do know, where would you put it? Okay, at the decade level, in terms of time, this is a phenomenon that plays out between the 1970s and the 1990s, roughly. Yeah. Okay, these are both political and economic. They are the result of policies typically from entities like the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund, which are, of course, political bodies, but they also wield significant economic resources and might. Yeah. Okay. Okay. So spatially, this belongs at nation-continent level. The institutions in question tend to be based in the U.S. and Europe. The World Bank, for example, and the IMF are principally creatures of the U.S. and Europe. And they impose these policies on a nation-by-nation basis, principally in the third world, Africa, South America, parts of Asia. And in a sense, that's you could almost call it a global phenomenon insofar as the World Bank and the IMF sort of came up with these policies in a kind of general sense. Like, these are the things we want to do, or these are the things we think are right or will work or are necessary, and then imposed them around the world, nation by nation. So, any others? Do you begin to get a sense of both? I mean, this can be useful as a way of starting to sort of stratify the different drivers, the different processes at play, and think about their interactions. It's not intended to result in some kind of nice, clean, simple, singular causal explanation. It's intended to be able to capture the variety of factors and processes that are intersecting and interacting in various ways to produce results that are both unique to places where they happen, depending on specific local circumstances, and also general or sharing common attributes across multiple cases. Okay? Are there any questions about that? One of the things we're going to do, I mean, Davis, for purposes of his explanation, his topic, right, global slums, he doesn't really need to talk about processes that play out over millennia. I mean, he invokes it, perhaps, in his discussion of human urban versus human rural sort of populations. But for the most part, he's focusing on events of the last 100 years or so, specifically the last 60 years or so. And he doesn't really need to talk about stuff that happened before. And you might say, oh, well, that's perfectly reasonable, right? Who needs, what difference does it make what happened in 1600 to understanding this particular phenomenon? And it's worth, I mean, it makes sense in that sense. On the other hand, one could always go and say, well, hold it. The cities were this big in 1950. Why were they that big in 1950? What led to there being cities there at all? Or what led to those cities having certain features, you know, this size or this language or this makeup of the population? And that's when, I mean, for instance, colonialism is a good example. If colonialism was such an important factor in this phenomenon, shouldn't we also know something about colonialism? Shouldn't we think about where it came from and how it got to be where it was in 1950 or 1960 when a lot of these colonies started achieving independence? And you can keep pushing it back and, in a sense, asking about broader or longer-term processes that created the conditions in which these more discrete events happened. And in a sense, that's what we're going to do. We're going to drop Davis now. We're going to put him on the shelf for the next month or two. And we're going to go back, and we're going to start 10,000 years ago. And we're going to look at processes of much larger scales and see how they unfold. And eventually, we'll make our way back to the present, and we'll focus in again on shorter time scales with a broader backdrop of understanding about what created the conditions in which this story unfolds, even though Davis himself doesn't really need to talk about them here. All right, any questions? Okay. I want to talk for a second. I want to come back for a second to the purposes of the research paper, or what it means to undertake research. I've mentioned already that part of the goal here is to differentiate in your minds and your experiences and your skills, your toolbox of skills, between what I called derisively or jokingly sort of Wikipedia-based research and more academic research. And I don't mean to sound like I'm, I don't mean to sound somehow dogmatic about academic research, but I do think that there is something of a misunderstanding in the popular imagination about what research is and what it means to do scholarly research. And I think it's worth thinking about this for a few minutes to help give you a better sense of why it matters to me or in this class or to this university, how you think about doing research. This is a passage from a lecture given by Max Weber in 1918. Anybody know who Max Weber was? Not a soul. There's one. Yes. Who was Max Weber? Very, very famous social scientist. He was from where? Germany. He lived a little bit longer than this. He was getting towards the end of his life. 1918 is World War I. He's actually giving this lecture in the midst of World War I. He gave a pair of lectures, one called Politics as a Vocation and one called Science as a Vocation. In this lecture, well, one more thing about Max Weber. It has been said of Max Weber that he was the last person who will ever live who knew everything there was to know about the world at the moment that he lived. Which is to say, he was an enormous nerd. I mean, the guy, granted, we're talking about a point in time when the number of books in the world was much smaller than it is now. But this is an extraordinarily erudite nerd who had read, so to speak, virtually everything there was to read, printed, perhaps not in all the Asian languages, but this guy spoke from a position of ridiculous erudition. He was also something of a basket case, if you read his biography. I mean, he was not a happy dude. But nonetheless, he was extraordinarily smart. And he had this to say about science. He says, in science, each of us knows that what he has accomplished will be antiquated in 10, 20, 50 years. That is the fate to which science is subjected. It is the very meaning of scientific work. Every scientific fulfillment raises new questions. It asks to be surpassed and outdated. Whoever wishes to serve science has to resign himself to this fact. Now, granted, the gender specificity of this is a little annoying, but it's not surprising. The point being that in undertaking science, you're not trying to somehow stake new ground and declare something that is true and will forever be true. That's not really scientific accomplishment. or at least you shouldn't think of it that way. You shouldn't expect that to be the result of scientific accomplishment. You should actually expect whatever you learn to subsequently become no longer what we know or antiquated. It should be surpassed. You should create new questions, and what you think is now true, you should expect it at some point to be rendered not the cutting edge and perhaps outright false. Scientific works will be surpassed scientifically. Let that be repeated, for it is our common fate and more our common goal. We cannot work without hoping that others will advance further than we have. In principle, this progress goes on ad infinitum, forever. What difference does this make to you and your research papers? Any? None? Science is itself a process. There's going to be occasions in this class where the role of scientific knowledge becomes part of the story, right? The progress in knowledge and technology and innovation drives things in ways that are very powerful. Science can be a force that has significant impacts in the world. Thinking about it in Weber's framework, though, this is a collective undertaking. It's not an individual undertaking. And one of the sort of defining principles of scholarly work is that it is shared. You publish what you have learned so that it is out there. You share it, in a sense, for free. Right? This is sort of the original open access system. The idea is that that knowledge needs to be shared in order that others can benefit from it, grow the larger collective enterprise of understanding and knowledge. It seeks to expand the limits of our knowledge in a specific way. That is, by reducing what we do not know rather than increasing what we do. And I've got a little goofy depiction of this for you. So this is you going to college. You arrive with a smile on your face. You know that there's this great big university, and it's full of knowledge, people and books and so on. And you've got a little teeny piece of it here when you arrive. You got in because your piece was impressive. And you're hoping that by the time you're done, it will be this big. That's about what you can count on, right? That's about as much as you can hope for from a college education. You're never going to get the whole kit and caboodle because it's just too big. Max Weber, the reason there won't be another one isn't because everyone else since then has been dumber than he was. It's just that this big thing called knowledge has gotten so big that even if Max Weber were alive today, he couldn't possibly encompass the whole thing, right? And that's because our knowledge has grown. Well, I want to suggest that this model is wrong. This little your face gets bigger model of knowledge. If this is all you're anticipating from college, then that's fine, but that you aren't approaching this the way a scholar or a scientist would approach this. You should think of it instead this way, in which there's a smaller thing called knowledge that we know, and then there's this infinite expanse of what we don't know. And you arrive at college with a certain amount of knowledge, and you position yourself on the edges of that realm of stuff we know. And you learn as much as you can about it in hopes that by the time you're done, your little smiley face will have expanded, but it will have actually pushed outward against the edges of this bubble of knowledge and reduced, even if just a teeny bit, this vast expanse of what we don't know. Now, why does this matter? I suggested a couple of things. There's a political sense in which this matters. A lot of my own work involves conservation in the southwestern United States, centering around ranching and endangered species and various land management practices and land uses. And the developers who are a major player in this story because they are buying ranches and turning them into subdivisions, which is, I imagine, something you're familiar with. They look to science and they want knowledge. They want to know, how many houses can I put here and still not render extinct some endangered species that happens to live here? And the bureaucrats from the Fish and Wildlife Service want to know that too. The landowners want to know that. The ranchers want to know, how many cattle can I run on this piece of land without endangering this species and getting myself in a whole lot of trouble with the Fish and Wildlife Service? Everybody seems to think that the scientists are about what we know, and that they will somehow provide this magical answer. You can have 6 houses here and everything will be fine. But if you have 7 houses, forget it. That bird is going extinct. Right? And this puts the scientists in a very difficult position, because the very best scientists on these matters, the ones who know the most, will insist that, in fact, we don't know. That's the nature of science, is to think not about what we do know, but about the limits of what we know, and by extension, what we don't know. We don't know if 6 houses, 7 houses, 10 houses will wipe out that population of southwest willow flycatchers. And the expectation on the part of the bureaucrats and the ranchers and the developers that scientists can provide that kind of knowledge is a real problem. And this comes up again and again and again and again in policy debates of all kinds. There's a popular notion that the scientists can just tell you, this is what will happen, give you predictive knowledge and certainty about something. And the best scientists will say, no, we can't. And then there emerges the not quite so best scientists who say, yes, we can. And they get lucrative contracts as consultants, or they get paid to testify in courtrooms, and they stand up and say, this is what we know. And in a sense, there's a tension there between science as I'm trying to suggest it operates, the sort of steady incremental elimination of ignorance, versus science as the positive, predictive establishment of something that is somehow permanently and certainly true. Okay, that's the political significance of it. There's also a sort of pedagogical significance. And this is where it matters for the purposes of your research papers. You can simply do a research paper. Come up with a topic, look it up in an encyclopedia or a database of some kind, and generate essentially a recitation of what other people have learned and said and thought. But that's not really what we're after here. We're more interested in pushing against the limits of what we don't know. So when you read a paper about a subject, instead of thinking, oh, well, this establishes once and for all and permanently X, Y, and Z, and I'm going to say it in 3 paragraphs, one about X and one about Y and one about Z. Try to think instead, okay, what are the shortcomings and limitations to this? What does this still leave unexplained? Is there a way of thinking about the question in a different way such that new ideas or possibilities emerge? And in a sense, the research challenge is to find the best information about the limits of our knowledge. That's why the most recent paper has a greater value than something that's 10 or 20 years old. It's been perhaps surpassed, like Faber says. So all of this is a sort of long-winded way of asking you to think about this as not just you absorbing some pre-existing bits and pieces of the knowledge of the world, but to actually use all of the knowledge that's been generated and that can be accessed through the incredible libraries and search engines available to you here, to try to think of new questions, try to think of what we don't know, and push against that in your own way. It's your own individual reformulation, rediscovery. You can always push against what's not known, and it's actually much more interesting than simply trying to absorb what is known. Does that make sense? Are there questions? Okay, this is outdated. We'll take a 5-minute break, and then we'll come back and move on to world regions in the other slides. Okay. Is Simon Williams here? Kit Kat or Hershey's? We have a winner in the map quiz competition. Nicely done. No trouble. All right. Now I realized after last lecture that a lot of what was in Chapter 3 of Davis, the reading for today, had actually been covered already in the preceding lecture. So I'm not going to talk more about Davis right now. I want to jump back a little bit to this question of world regions. I said early last week that we don't approach this class the way it's typically approached or is approached in most world regional geography textbooks. And I want to elaborate a little bit more on why that is using a series of maps from a book called The Myth of Continents. It came out 13 years ago. It's written by a historian and a geographer. And their initial purpose is just to say, wait a minute, this world regional sort of framework that dominates or has dominated geography for a long time is flawed. So here's a piece of evidence in support of that. The 7 continents and their displacement in popular imagination. Here they're simply pointing out that there is a sort of strict way of defining the continents, and that's what the dark, heavy black lines here are indicating, in which it's simply a question of, okay, what are the boundaries between these terrestrial land masses, right? However, they point out, if you look at the way people actually talk, the way people use terms like Asia or North America, you can figure out from the way they use them that they don't always mean the same thing as those continents strictly defined would suggest. So, for example, when people talk about North America, do they always mean to include Mexico? I think it's fair to say that in a lot of cases they talk about North America, and what they really mean is the U.S. and Canada. Or maybe they mean to include Mexico, but they don't mean to include the rest of Central America. Belize and Guatemala and Costa Rica, those countries there on the isthmus, Panama, which technically are part of North America if you're thinking about it strictly as continents. And the lighter, thinner black lines indicate these more restricted areas. Greenland. When you say North America, do you think Greenland is part of what you're talking about? No? Or have you just never thought about it one way or the other? Yeah, there's that problem too. Greenland, from a strict point of view, is part of North America. But in fact, it's almost never encompassed in people's claims about North America or their use of the term North America. Sometimes Australia is treated as part of Asia in certain respects. They point out that the official boundary between Asia and Oceania runs right through the island of New Guinea, Papua New Guinea. Half of it is in one continent, half of it is another, according to the ways in which these terms are typically used. They point out that if you are a geologist and you're thinking about the movement of the plates, the tectonic movements of the continents, that in fact the entire island belongs with Australia. But it is not treated as part of Australia in most uses of the term Asia or Australia, right? Asia frequently, you can see frequently people don't think of Siberia as part of Asia. When they say Asia, they're thinking principally about China and India and maybe Southeast Asia. The question of Europe. Where exactly is the boundary between Europe and Asia? Why are they treated as two separate continents in the first place? They are, after all, one landmass. North Africa, countries like Algeria, Libya, frequently is not sort of part of the mental idea of Africa. Instead, they are treated frequently as part of the Middle East. And there are some good reasons for that. But their point here is simply that it doesn't map onto the continents themselves. And this sort of underscores the point I made earlier about the incoherence or weaknesses of starting from the idea that there are continents, the continents define regions, those regions are somehow coherent as such, and we can understand the world continent by continent. They provide this map which depicts the West, the idea of the West, in different uses, different moments in time. The West is the area encompassed by the dark black line in each of these maps. And you start up with map number 1. There are historical documents in which the West basically includes nothing but Great Britain. Everything else was outside of this realm understood to be the West. Later, it came to include France and the Netherlands, as well as Great Britain. So that was the West. Later on, it came to mean Western Europe, sort of the limits of Christendom. After the conquest of the New World and the establishment of the United States and the migrations associated with the colonial period, it came to mean the US, Canada, Western Europe, and other places dominated by descendants of Europeans. Australia was part of it. The Philippines came to be understood as part of the West at that point in time. Later on, there are uses of it in which it encompasses basically everywhere there are European democratic liberal governments. And you can see that it comes to include sort of everything other than Africa and Asia. There are uses of the West in which it includes everyone, all the parts of the world in which the people there look to Jerusalem and or Mecca as the sort of religious center point. So all of Christendom and all of the Islamic world are treated as the West, and those people who do not adhere to those religions are somehow not the West. And that's what map number 6 depicts. And then map number 7 is perhaps the final logical extreme. And this is the West in which the entire world is the West. And how would that possibly be? Any idea? This is a variant on a sort of Cold War idea, in which basically the whole world is ruled in one way or another by the United States and the Soviet Union, and the ideologies of those political systems can be traced to the West, right? So they can be traced to European ideas about democracy, capitalism, communism, that kind of thing. And the West basically is everything in the world except Antarctica. This is just intended to suggest how fluid or fungible, malleable these concepts are. Here we have the East, or the Orient, which is, of course, the opposite of the West. It's the other against which the West is defined at different points in time. And it starts out as limited to what we now call the Middle East, and it expands in various ways over time to include or exclude parts of the world based on a sort of mishmash of underlying criteria or principles. Note that the whole basic choice of terminology in the first place, West versus East, assumes that you're looking at the world from a particular point of view, right? Which happens to be roughly London, right? So that the West is anything west of London, or roughly in that kind of sphere of influence or orbit. The East is that which is east of London. And we talk about the Near East, the Far East, that is to say, east but near to London versus east but far from London, right? There is a Eurocentrism to these categories that is worth questioning or criticizing. Arnold Toynbee, a famous historian, wrote a magisterial 6-volume work in the early to mid 20th century, trying to sort of tell the grand sweeping history of the world's civilizations. As of about 1952, this is the way he regionalized the world. And you'll see that the West here includes all of the Americas plus Australia and the Philippines. Any idea why? Does that make sense? I mean, it requires that you sort of combine a number of possible criteria, racial categories, religious categories, political categories. The Philippines, of course, being dominated by the United States, somehow fall into this umbrella of the Western civilization. Eastern Europe, he characterizes as debatable, because it wasn't clear to him whether it should be counted as part of the West. I'm sorry, West also including Western Europe, of course. But whether Eastern Europe should be part of the West or part of the Russian civilization was at that point debatable. Of course, it wasn't long after this that the Soviet Union starts militarily taking over many of those countries. Large parts of Africa and parts of Southeast Asia are treated as primitive, still uncommitted. They haven't decided which civilization they wish to be a part of, apparently. Central Asia gets divided up according to religious categories. India is treated not as Indic but as Hindu because of the predominantly Hindu population there. Other parts of Asia are characterized as Indic independently of the actual makeup of the population there when you start looking at the breakdown between Muslim and non-Muslim populations there, that kind of thing. This is the standard world regions as of 1975, according to the authors of the book. This is very much what you'll find in textbooks of that period, to some degree even still today, although obviously the Soviet Union has fallen and that label no longer applies to that part of the world. And you'll see the dotted areas are areas that kind of don't, it's ambiguous. Sometimes they're treated as part of one region, sometimes they're treated as part of another. This includes parts of Africa, several areas like Mongolia in Asia, whether that should be treated as part of the Soviet Union in Eastern Europe. Of course, at the time, the Soviet Union did dominate Mongolia, or whether it should be treated as part of East Asia, which from a cultural perspective would probably make a lot more sense. Those types of questions. And again, you see that, well, that poor half of Papua New Guinea apparently has no regional status whatsoever. Or it's sort of out there with Oceania, which is not even labeled. So they do have a positive message to offer by the end, although I'm not sure it really makes sense. I mean, after undermining the idea that regions are a coherent way of approaching the world, and they offer a variety of solid reasons to think that this is not really a very helpful way of spatializing your understanding of the world. Some of these include phenomena such as globalization, right? You can see ways in which patterns emerge or get generated in the world today that aren't geographically contiguous, right? What do you make of the prevalence of certain kinds of media or images and fashions that are that move through media and pop up way far away from where they originated in a way that's not continuous. It's not like you can draw a line on a map and say, well, everything inside this line shares a fondness for American sitcoms, right? It's actually very spotty, patchy, broken up. But this is the framework they say they use when they teach world regional geography. So they take the coast, the Caribbean and the east coast, northeast coast of South America, and they say that this is actually an African-American region because of the movement of slaves and the settlement and the dominance of those peoples and cultures in those parts of the Caribbean Basin and South America. And that is, they suggest, should be distinguished from Ibero-America, where you see populations dominated much more by the descendants of Spanish colonists and the mestizos and Indian populations that they intermixed with, right? Sub-Saharan Africa should be separated from Southwest Asia and North Africa. Ethiopia, in a lot of these maps, also in Toynbee, you see the Syriac. Ethiopia has a very unique status, doesn't quite fit in a lot of these regional sort of systematizations of the world. And then finally, Central Asia, which they suggest should be subdivided further according to the dominant religious orientations of the peoples there, even as they also occupy a common region called Central Asia. Any questions about that? I would recommend the book if you're interested in this. And the reading for next week, we're going to start Crosby, chapters 1 and 2 for Tuesday, chapters 4 and 5 for Thursday. We will watch a movie in class on the 9th. I also have some pages from the Atlas to read by the 11th. And there will be a map quiz in sections next week. We will see you next week.